Hi everybody. So I'm not in class today, but I still have to present my slideshow. So this is the differences between the male and female brain. So the basic questions that I'm going to talk about in this slideshow are: what are the anatomical differences between male and female brains? Are the differences in the male and female brains what causes differences between the sexes? Um, Specifically, like thinking, personality, and just general differences between the emotions and actions of the sexes, and then what are the results of the differing brains. Okay, so this slide talks about the basic anatomical differences between the sexes. So we have the male and the female brains, and this graphic shows us just the connections between the connections in the brains. So as you can see in the male brain, most of the connections run front to back. Through the same hemisphere. And then in the female brain, the connections go from one side to the other. So it's not like it is in the male brain. You can see the differences. And the connections in the male brain can account for better spatial skills and motor control. And then in the female brain, these connections can account for the skills that women have in verbal skills and intuitive abilities that they're normally better at than men. Okay, so in this slide, we're talking about more of the anatomical differences. So first off, men's brains are bigger. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're smarter than women, but their brains are generally larger than women's. But when you think about it, men on average, I mean, their bodies are generally larger than women, so that makes sense. Women have larger hippocampuses, so that is what's responsible for memorization. So this is part of why women tend to have better memory than men and why they connect memories to their thoughts and their thinking, and they just tend to make those connections better than men do. And then men's amygdala is also larger than women's. So this is what is responsible for experiencing emotions. And this is actually something that was surprising to me because when you think about it, I mean, the stereotype is that women are more emotional than men. But that's just not something that we're shown when you look at the anatomy. And then an example of differing brain structure is that when women and men were both shown an emotional film, the left amygdala in women was more active, whereas in men it was the right. And then we see that the right and left amygdala have independent memory systems. So the right is more geared towards negative emotion, and the left is the reward system of the brain. So in women, they tended to experience emotions, and this was more focused on the reward system, and then in men, it was more focused on negative emotion. Okay, so this slide talks about differences and neurosexism. So the differences between the male and female brains are related to the connections in the brain and the anatomy. This makes sense. I mean, this is something that it's logical. And then when we look at neurosexism, is when people fall into the trap of attributing the differences in male and female brains to common stereotypes. So this is saying like, oh, men's brains are bigger, so that means that they're smarter. that would be an example of neurosexism. And that's something that we don't want to fall into that trap of when we are looking at and researching um, the differences between men and women's brains. So I just wanted to bring this up just to show us that this is something that we don't want to do when researching. Okay, so this is Shaw's study. So this is a study that happened in 1998, and there was a scientist and a psychologist, and his name was Shaw, and he did a study in order to find differences in the brains based on sex. And he focused specifically on neural circuits. The behaviors that the study focused on finding circuits for were aggression, mating, and parenting. And he focused on those because those were behaviors that are essential for the survival of the species. And these are behaviors that tend to be innate rather than learned. I mean, he wasn't going to study that like people like cooking or sleeping or exercising or things like that, because those things, people tend to be more influenced by those things. But when we look at aggression, mating, and parenting, I mean, those are all things that are innate. I mean, people have children, people mate, and then aggression, all of these things are things that are hardwired into us. So by studying these things, it was easier to see the differences that came about based on sex and to see the connections to the differences in the anatomy of the brains. Okay, so now we're going to focus on nature versus nurture. And this is a very common question in psychology. This is something that is talked about so much. So the nature versus nurture issue is common in many areas of study. So when we determine the differences between male and female brains, nature versus nurture plays a large role. Okay? So differences on the nature side of things. Women tend to be naturally better at reading and comprehension, and then men tend to be better at math and STEM-based activities. Women have better long-term memory and men have better working memory. So these are just some basic differences. And then when we look at differences on the nurture side of things, we see that from a young age, little girls are taught to become mothers. An example of this would be like being given dolls and doll houses and like a baby doll to take care of. And then boys are taught to be strong and to push through injuries. So if you see like a little boy fall down and he scrapes his knee, his dad might be like, "Oh, get up, like you're fine, brush it off." But then if that same thing were to happen to a little girl, her parents might say like, "Oh, it's okay, sweetie, like you're fine, like we're here for you, you're gonna be okay." So we see the differences just between the way that they're raised, and this is more of the nurture side of it. And these differences are part of why we cannot contribute a male or female perspective, thinking, and personality exclusively to brain structure, because it's not all nature and it's not all nurture. So it's not all based on the anatomy of the brains, but it's not all based on the way that we're raised and the way that we are shaped by our environment and society. Okay, so more differences. While men and women both have inherent differences, they are only able to be recognized at about the 3-month mark. So when a baby is about 1 month old, there aren't as many differences that are easily recognized as between men and male and female babies as there are at the 3-month mark. The 3-month mark is when you can start to tell the differences that are inherent between the sexes. And examples of this, infant girls respond better to faces and have better facial recognition. And even as they grow into maturity, women respond better to faces while men respond to things. So this is one difference that we can see in infancy, and then it stays the same through maturity. Okay, so cognitive disorders. So women are twice as likely to experience clinical depression and PTSD. Men are twice as likely to become substance dependent, and men are 40% more likely to develop schizophrenia. Men are also 10 times more likely to have dyslexia, and men are 4 times more likely to be on the autism spectrum. So these are just some things. It's like saying that you have a genetic disposition in your family for autoimmune diseases. It's sort of the same thing for men and women. There are some things that men tend to be more prone to because of their different anatomy than women, and then there are some things that women tend to be more prone for and more prone to. Okay, so in conclusion, there are some basic anatomical differences between male and female brains, but in keeping with the principle of correlation not equating to causation, we know that the disorders that men and women are more prone to are not necessarily caused by the differences in brain structure. Um, Personality and differences in thinking cannot be attributed to the differing anatomy. So even though there are differences between males and females, and there are anatomical differences within their brains, we can't attribute every difference we see to the differing brain anatomy. And there are differences between men and women, and that has been known for forever. I mean, everyone knows that. But it's not all based on their nature, and it's not all based on nurture.